Good afternoon all, and welcome to everybody. Welcome to all of the delegates that are joining us today. I'm really pleased to say we've had over 100 people respond to this. So that's really excellent. It really shows how committed people are to both to fair trade and to this disturbing subject of climate change. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Joy Podbury, the Mayor of Tunbridge Wells, and Joy's going to do the official welcome. But first, I'm just going to tell you then that each of our each of our panelists will speak in turn. We'll start with Harry Frederick, followed by Patrick when he joins us, and we're hoping he is going to join us from Kenya. We're waiting for him to get on now. And then finally, Adam Gardner will speak. Adam is from the Fairtrade Foundation. And after that, we'll open the floor to questions. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A function. But first of all, let me welcome Joy and allow Joy to welcome you.
Thank you very much. I'm actually delighted to be here and been asked to host this event for Tunbridge Wells Fair Trade Fortnight 2021. It's wonderful that so many of you have been able to join us to hear why fair trade is crucial to fighting the climate crisis and how fair trade helps not only people, but also the planet. Each year, thousands of individuals, businesses, schools and campaign groups come together to share stories of the people who grow our food, mine our gold, and grow the cotton in our clothes. People who are often exploited and underpaid. Fair trade means farmers are not only paid a fair price for the produce, but their communities also benefit from an extra sum of money to invest in their communities. Some choose to build a school, others improve water and electricity supplies. I'm very proud that Tunbridge Wells is an established fair trade town. It's a shared achievement and an opportunity for us all to help make a difference to farmers in developing countries. Many successful events have been arranged in the past to mark Fair Trade Fortnight. This year, we are invited to take part in a fair trade themed photographic competition, Picture the World You Want. The closing date is 31st of March. Look for details in this week's issue of Local magazine and on social media. The competition is for all ages and abilities, so do have a go. In the past, the group have hosted talks from experts and producers on a range of topics. The theme for this year is Choose the World You Want. The aim is to highlight the changes that climate change brings to farmers and workers across the world. The climate crisis is an ever-increasing threat. We're already seeing impacts from droughts, floods, heat waves and crop disease. I'm delighted that Adam Gardner from Fairtrade Foundation is joining us today. He will explain how fair trade farmers are helped become more resilient to climate change. We're also fortunate to have two practitioners join us, Patrick, a fair trade tea producer from Kenya, and Harry, a Penshurst farmer who's already made changes to his farming methods because of climate change. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all for taking part. I hope you all enjoy the webinar and will continue to support the work of Tunbridge Wells Fair Trade Town Group and choose fair trade produce. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joy. And really just on behalf of the Tunbridge Wells Fair Trade Town Group, I'd just like to say how terrific it has been to have the support of the council and to maintain Tunbridge Wells as a fair trade town. Just to give a little bit of context, obviously, although this might not be obvious, almost everything that we eat is the result of farms, farming and farmers. Every day we read more and more about the effects of climate change, and without going into the details, science really confirms the fact that globally temperatures are rising. Without making any assumptions, I think most people believe the science. Now, any region's agricultural stability and hence its food security depends on reliable natural climate variations. and seasonal shifts in weather. But across the world, climate change is altering regional growing conditions and making them more unpredictable. New research suggests, for example, that that climate change may radically redefine the regions best suited to grow, for example, coffee. In Ethiopia, coffee is one of the country's most valuable crops and employs something like 15 million people in its supply chain. If you're a small producer there and all of a sudden your land is unable to support the production of coffee beans, you're in a lot of trouble. It's all very well for us to say, well, we'll just move it somewhere else. But if you own the land, what are you going to do? In Kenya, climate change has caused a geographical shift in which the areas which receive rain and which suffer, in Kenya, climate change has caused a geographical shift in which areas receive rain and which suffer drought. Climate change also affects what goes on beneath the Earth's surface. To sustain an agricultural system with consistent, high quality yield, the soil system must be able to support plants. Bear in mind as well that 90% of the world's organisms live in the soil. However, according to a 2015 report, around 1/3 of the world's soil is moderately to highly degraded, and the conditions causing degradation are getting worse. So there's really 2 points I want you to take out of this. Number one point, and this is the fair trade thing, is that small farms, which actually account for 90% of the world's 570 million farms, are the ones which are the most vulnerable to change. Secondly, the world is a single but very complex structure of interconnected ecosystems. Climate modes causally connect distant regions, something which is increasingly important as agricultural trade has become more global. The thing to remember is a climate shift in one food growing region can affect crops half a world away. It's not just something that happens over there. And so for that reason, it's great today that we've got Harry from Penshurst, just down the road from Tunbridge Wells. And we've also got Patrick joining us from Kenya. And we've got, and Adam, of course, to join us from the Fairtrade Foundation. After each of them has spoken, we'll open up the floor and try and deal with any questions that you've got to ask. And we'll try and get all of that done by our 1 o'clock finish time. So without kind of really any further ado, let me just introduce to you Harry Fredericks from Penshurst and hand over to him.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank you, Damien. Yes, so my name is Harry Frederick. I am a farmer from Penshurst near Tunbridge Wells, and I've got a little presentation here. I'll try and share my screen and show it to you all. Yeah, so I farm in Penshurst. We have about 600 acres, and we are a mixed farm. So we have, we're mostly arable, so we mostly grow crops, but we also have a few animals. These cows are about 4 or 5 cows, and we have 250 sheep. And I'm learning how to bring this all into a combined system instead of seeing them as separate enterprises. And that's something I'm having to learn how to do because the climate is changing and it's becoming more and more important as we go. So I've got a few pictures for you here. This is Jim, my esteemed colleague who helps me out with the sheep. And there's a few pictures of some of the animals and us making hay up there. And I actually studied architecture about 15 years ago now. But I have a family farm, and I always loved the sort of connection with nature, the reliance upon the elements that you have to have as farming. You realize you're sort of so helpless to control nature. You have to work with it, and it's no good trying to sort of beat nature back and create what you want in a field. You kind of have to work with the elements. And we've had this sort of really stable period for 10,000 years or so, where particularly in the UK, we're very, very fortunate. We have the right amount of rain, the right amount of sun to grow most crops, or these sort of UK-based crops, and a lot of grass. And that is really under threat at the moment, as you will know with climate change. For example, in the past 2 years, we've had to reseed our winter crops. We've had floods over the winter. I'll show you. There's a couple of pictures here This one top right is of our farm last winter, and this is another picture from Farmers Weekly. And it shows, you know, you're not going to grow many crops on these fields, and the crops that were there will have to be reseeded in the summer. And then in the summer, we see that we're getting these droughts, and the crops you sow there, you know, the harvests are about a third down on yield. So even in the UK, a very temperate climate, we're really seeing these sort of freakish weather patterns just more and more regularly. And I go back to this quote that I quite like. It says, "Man, despite his artistic pretensions, his sophistication, and his many accomplishments, owes his existence to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains." So this really is quite a fragile sort of system we have at the moment, that we are losing this sort of stability at the moment. And so this soil is what I want to talk about a little bit more of today. So the soil is sort of quite an overlooked element in climate change, and Damien talked about it earlier a little bit. There's been sort of reports that, such as from the UN here, that unless these new approaches are adopted, the global amount of arable and productive land per person may only be a quarter of the level it was in 1960 in 2050. And soils essentially are driven by carbon content. And when we lose the carbon out of the soil and into the atmosphere, we're increasing global warming by putting more carbon in the atmosphere, and we're reducing our ability to grow crops. And this gets a vicious cycle where we get less carbon in the soil and more in the atmosphere. And some people think we may only have 60 years of production left in these areas. So it's something really, really vital that farmers need to talk about. And George Monbiot, a environmental campaigner, says, "Almost all other issues are superficial by comparison to soil loss. So why don't we talk about it?" So that's why we're talking about it. So just to look at a few examples here on the carbon content of soil. They really vary dependent on the soil use. So the grasslands on our farm will have much higher carbon content than the arable land. And so we've been looking on our farm at bringing grassland rotations back into the arable, putting a few animals on there to increase fertility. And this sort of mixed system that is quite a traditional one, and until sort of the mechanization of farms was a more traditional sustainable system. And an example here, if Europe's soils increased their carbon content by only 0.1%, which is a very small change and very achievable on a farm, this would be the same as the reduction of the annual emissions of 100 million cars. So it's some quite big figures that we're dealing with this. So I've been, I guess, put myself under a heading of regenerative agriculture, and this describes farming and grazing practices that restore degraded soil, improve biodiversity, and increase carbon capture, to give long-lasting environmental benefits, which can positively impact climate change. So how am I practicing regenerative agriculture on my farm? One of the first things we're doing, which we've done for quite a while, my dad started off, is doing direct drilling. And this is where we don't cultivate the soil at all. And instead we plant the new crop into the top of the previous crop. And this maintains the soil as this sort of ecosystem and doesn't sort of mulch it up each year, which leads to leaching and erosion, and allows sort of more air to get in the soil and the worms to grow. We need these large worm populations. This is sort of, this, as we've seen already by doing tests, we've seen more organic matter in the soil, and we've seen sort of greater, slow, probably more consistent yields sort of year on year. You don't get these sort of big spikes with big amounts of fertilizer, but it's a more consistent, a more resilient system as the climate changes. Something that is being encouraged is integrated pest management. That's a sort of heading where it's looking at how using a can of spray essentially is your last resort in a field in order to control a pest or something. And we've been looking at increasing the size of our hedgerows, planting wildflower strips, and this sort of encourages the natural pollinators, the natural predators. And when you use an insecticide, you kill all the insects and you kill the beneficial ones as well. So it's sort of trying to work away, how can we work with nature instead of killing, what a lot of things to get an outcome. And we're looking at longer crop rotations as well, which include cover crops, such as clovers, which naturally take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put it into the ground for the next year's sort of crop of wheat or something like that. And also looking at tree planting. We planted a lot of trees historically on this farm, and I want to really continue this in the future, plant some more trees. And how can we also incorporate that in maybe an agroforestry sort of scheme where we're seeing trees within arable systems. And you might sort of wonder why, there's a lot of sort of news about how animals are bad for the environment, how livestock aren't beneficial. But why I still want to incorporate animals into our system is because of the benefits they really can bring. Because if you remove all the ruminants out of the UK ecosystem, you're losing a big sort of chunk of a functioning ecosystem, one that was here a lot longer than longer ago than even when we moved to the UK. And so by reducing livestock numbers, but using them in this rotational way of putting them on an arable field and moving them on, we are increasing sort of the fertility of our soils and increasing the carbon content. This is just a little diagram that explains this a little bit better. Looking at the sort of the one-way ticket of carbon out of fossil fuels straight into the atmosphere, but then looking at this natural cycle. If a cow, there's many systems for farming ruminants such as cattle and sheep, but when a cow is a grass-fed cow, it's a natural system that when it's not overgrazed is one that's been going for a long time and is really beneficial to the ground, rather than one where you're taking it out and putting it in a barn and bringing it feed. So that's the sort of system we're looking at on our farm. There's just a quick case study here. The National Trust have actually started introducing cattle into areas to sort of disrupt the natural landscape where you get quite sterile and stale areas. The cows can sort of move seeds, and these plants have they've evolved to be eaten, to spread their seeds that way and stuff. So it's quite interesting seeing how cattle are being reintroduced in some areas. And there's new legislation coming in 2024. And this is from the government now that we've left the EU. It's called the Environmental Land Management. And the tagline is public money for public good. So I'm sort of cautiously optimistic because they are looking at these sort of regenerative practices, but you just really hope that instead of a box ticking exercise, it's going to be some really interesting things that will get funded and some tree planting and things like that. So we'll find out. But I just quite like this quote by the Nature Friendly Farming Network. And they say here, with more than 70% of the UK's land being farmland, farmers are one of the best tools the government has to deliver on food security, biodiversity, and climate targets. And increasingly, we see the role of a farmer as someone who delivers a combination of food production, climate mitigation, and nature protection. And that really excites me, seeing my role as a farmer, not just to provide food, but also to sort of manage this land that in 60 years' time, it's in an even greater state. And I'm not just providing food, but also, helping the fight against climate change. There's just one last thing here, which is the carbon footprinting tool, which we're being encouraged to use. So you're taking your emissions, so your fuels, your materials, any methane from the livestock, and then you're balancing it against what benefits does this, if you tweak one of these things, how does this change your soil carbon or the amount of carbon stored in the hedgerows and things like this. And there's an example here. I was on a webinar recently where we were looking at this. So that's something I want to have a look at on my farm.
I'm going to hand on to Adam Gardner from Fairtrade right now.
Well, that was fascinating. I certainly learnt a lot there. And that quote about relying on those 6 inches of topsoil, really, really poignant. And also the other sort of reflections on the role of the farmers as well, who are stewarding this land, which is just so important to feeding the whole globe. I'll say a little bit more about Fairtrade's response in a second, but firstly, I just wanted to introduce Patrick, another one of those farmers protecting soil in a different context in Kenya. And Patrick, I was lucky enough to meet Patrick for the first time. It was about 7 years ago now, when Patrick visited the UK. on a fair trade producer tour. And Patrick farms tea in Kenya, but is also involved with training other farmers around within his organization in adapting to the effects of climate change. So without further ado, Patrick, you're very welcome to Tunbridge Wells.
Jambo. My name is Patrick, and thank you, Adam, for this wonderful invitation. And thank you, Mr. Frederick, for a very, very informative perspective of climate change in UK at the moment. It's very interesting, and I'll start by agreeing with a few things that you have said, which are very, very really interesting. What we we have similar programs like sustainable agriculture, where you call it regenerative agriculture, which I found to be wonderful. And then about drilling on specific holes, that's something we call minimum tillage, because most of our people, they till the land. So instead of doing a tractor to harrow the land, you dig the holes with a hoe. You see? So you don't disturb the soil around, and you just put your crop on that specific hole. Minimum tillage really retains the soil as it is, and it does not lose a lot of water or encourage erosion or yeah. So that's and when you talked about integrated pest management system, I spot on. That's lovely. That's similar things that we are doing instead of these organic chemicals and fertilizers. So basically, tea is a monoculture. In most cases, if I might just lift this a bit, I'm in a tea estate. So if I would move out of the screen and show you just how it looks like as I speak, you are seeing now part of our collective farm where the farmers of Michimikoro came together and bought this. It's a 600-acre piece of land. So it's almost similar to what Mr. Frederick was talking about. So there's just part of it. You can see how we have integrated the trees and the rivers, or where you see the trees between the tea plantation are rivers where we have planted natural trees that are very good in conserving the environment. And you can see where we have new varieties, because I'm going to talk about very soon how we are addressing effects of climate change. What you see here is a stump which was planted early 60s. So we are shifting from this and planting new. I don't know if you can see it. Let me see if you can see the new plantation that is taking shape. We are replacing the old with the new, because the old used to consume a lot of water, and then they are past their date. Tea, when it is around 50 years or 40, from 40 years it starts going moribund. Moribund is a state where it does not give you the production for the similar input. I think this is the best place you can see now the new plantation against the old plantation. So basically that's just a bit of a life tour of our farm. And you find this in many farms who planted tea late in 1960s and 70s. So having shown you that, I'll be now ready to talk about climate change, how it is affecting our life as tea farmers. Tea is a labor-intensive crop. Tea is a capital-intensive crop. And to bring tea into bearing, when our grandfathers and fathers started planting this farm in 1960s and 70s, and other farms around Michimikoro, because I come from Michimikoro in Kenya, it was very easy to establish the plantation. A tea farm was very easy. In 2 to 3 years' time, you are plucking your tea, no problem. But today, what I've just shown you will take us around 5 years. Because why? The rainfall that used to be there 40 years ago, 30 years ago, is no longer the same amount of rainfall that is coming. Rainfall used to be very predictable. You knew when it will rain. You can plan your season, you can plan what to plant, but at the moment now, it is unpredictable. You can have a 1 month rain in 1 day or 1 week. So what do we do to prevent all that water going to the ocean? We advise farmers to plant trees, dig terraces. Literally what we try to do is walk the water to the river instead of let it run. Because when it runs, as Mr. Frederick said, it will go away with the topsoil. And when the topsoil is gone, the quality of that soil, the kind of crops that can grow on that soil is degraded, and nothing might grow there in a very long time, unless there are 3 crops that might need to tap the water from the ground. So it's a mitigation now against the climate change where we plant the trees. And it is our experience as we watch these things happening. A farmer will tell you what Mr. Frederick was talking about, our observations that he has lived with them and he's seeing things changing. And that is what is happening here in Kenya. We are seeing the changes. And when we joined Fairtrade, when we didn't know, the government projects, sometimes, you know, governments all over the world, they are very good on paper, but sometimes implementation becomes a problem. But when Fairtrade came in and we partnered with Mechemekoro Tea Company, we started 3 nurseries. We started trainings for farmers. And that change in mind, that farmers really starting to see what we are seeing as a change, there is a way we can reverse this or mitigate and contain so that it does not take away our livelihood and we have nothing to give to our grandchildren. 60 years, as Mr. Frederick said, is a shocking statistic, but it is a reality. If we do things properly now, we might increase that to 120 years by our own actions as farmers at the moment. So tea farmers, our problem basically with the environment is that we have to exploit the environment to get our living. So sometimes where tea is not grown and the food crops are grown, banned agricultural practices, that is what happens when a farmer has nothing to do, but he has to plant a crop. And he has no time to wait for a tree to grow, you cut it down for firewood. So if you don't provide alternative sources of energy, alternative sources of food income, which is the single most expensive commodity to every farming family in Kenya and in Africa and in the world, I think, the single most expensive is food. Next comes education, and then health. So it's better sometimes people might not go to hospital. If they are hungry, they would rather eat something and then kill the disease through natural ways like herbs and prayers sometimes, which does not go very far. So what I'm trying to say here is that we are twinned with climate. We are twinned with the environment. And our actions, either singularly or in plural, are taking us to a direction that is irreversible. But with Fairtrade and good people who are ready to support the movement, to support the producers, such that when you buy my tea and you give a premium of the tea, that premium is what we deploy to plant trees, do nurseries, terraces, trainings, beyond classrooms, address things that farmers themselves have pointed out are things that they need done, but they are too poor, or the income from tea is not enough to do those other activities. So at least somebody will take his whole package, but the premium that was on top will be deployed to do these socio activities that are supporting the production of tea as a cash crop. So in our situation, I'm very glad that we are seeing things together. This is a very, very important session for me, having seen a farmer and listened to him. It is so important that we can relate with what he's saying. I can relate with what he has written. And all this makes my feeling that at least we are not alone. Possibly, the kind of problems that you might be having, the land size. In our case now, the minimum, mostly, you find that the farmer is an average of 1 acre or 1.5 acres or half an acre. So majority are at around 1 acre land holding. And the majority size of a family is 5 members. And they will depend on that land for everything that they have. If they are lucky and they educate a child, like we did with the Fairtrade premiums and educating that 6 students who are now university graduates, their families now are far much better off than they could have been. The pressure on the land has reduced and the families have more disposable income. And that's the best form of charity that you can offer in the world. Supporting a producer in the business that he's doing, he can do it sustainably. If he can sustain his life through his business, there will be no need for somebody to go elsewhere to look for greener pastures. We will be able now to educate our children who will go get better jobs. They will be more productive in the country, in the world, because education makes you a citizen of the world. And then the pressure they release on the farms, we might, that is the size of the farms, as small as they are, they will have people who they will be able to support. And these kind of interactions between the producers and the Fairtrade Foundation members and the campaigners in UK makes all these things come together in a way that cannot be imagined. So I could talk so much about a few challenges that we have. The worst thing what we get paid on production per kilo is not enough to sustain a farmer's family. For example, 1 kilo of my tea, although it is 100% Fairtrade certified, is in the market, it's like £2. And the cost, if I'm putting it in your money, that is like £2 per kilo. And that is in bulk. If I have and a chance to value hand, maybe it could be £5. But that same kilo, when it goes out there, it will fetch more money. But it is lost in between. The value chain gets more than the farmer gets for the handwork of picking this tea, growing the tea under those difficult circumstances, and still the payment will be minimal. So it does, tea as a business is a sustainable way of us living not so comfortably, but at least you have something to look forward to. So the payment that we get is not really what we would want to get, but you cannot dictate to the market, but you cannot also ignore the environment, because you need the environment to continue the life you have, if not better it. So the challenges that are there in the food value chain are almost universal worldwide. But the issue of climate change, that's the point I want really to get home. It's more painful to us farmers in the global south than the farmers in the north. We are really exposed. The temperatures are rising, wind speeds are increasing, and the income from our business is dwindling. So we need support, especially to retain the climate or reverse it. And with that, I will hand over to Adam Gardner. I'll take questions later. That was just a brief overview. As we finish, I'll take questions later. Thank you so much. Asante.
Okay, thank you so much, Patrick, for all of that and taking us from Kent or wherever we are directly to Kenya to your farm. It's not easy to follow those two presentations, but what a privilege it is to hear from two farmers really on the front line across the globe. The last year of COVID and also the climate crisis have been powerful reminders of how we're all connected, but it's really brought home some of the shared challenges that we face actually in terms of transforming farming globally in the way it needs to happen for the years ahead. And also I hear you there, Patrick, on the need that transformation needs financing. It needs to be led by the science and also the experience and expertise, the voice of farmers. the long-term goal of fair trade has always been that the fair trade mark wouldn't be needed to embed those values of fair prices and knowing and respecting the farmer who is behind the things that we consume every day. And taking those values and principles and scaling them up, so it's not just companies who choose to opt into fair trade, but these are across the board. So the fair trade mark has always sought to be a trailblazer to show how trade can happen in a fairer way. And I think events like today are really important, because it's only when we can join the dots and find the common cause and get to the root issues that we need to, if we're going to transform our food production, that we're really going to achieve that. There's not too much for me to say, really, to follow on from that. We've already heard powerfully about the impact that climate change is already having for Patrick, and in my position I get to speak to quite a few other fair trade farmers in other countries as well, where fair trade is working, and it's a really common story how the changing weather patterns impacting on yields right now, both of crops like tea and coffee, but also other local food crops grown. So it's an issue of livelihoods and food security too. But there's also so many inspiring examples that we've been hearing through the Fairtrade Fortnight Festival, Choose the World You Want, this year, of how Fairtrade farmers are already better equipped to deal with these impacts, whether that be investing Fairtrade Premium in diversification and growing new crops, or whether it's investing in emergency funds so that when hurricanes strike, particularly in places like the Caribbean, farmers have some finance to access to be able to get back on their feet as quickly as possible. And of course, it's a really important year this year, with the UK hosting the UN Climate Summit later in the year, that we speak about these and make it a public conversation, to give a bigger platform and to switch more of our communities on to thinking about the people who are behind the food that we rely on. So there's, as I mentioned, there's a lot more different events and content and stories that, from the Fairtrade Fortnight Festival that you can engage with, and I'll pop a link in the chat in just a little while, but I'm sure you probably would rather hear a little bit more from Patrick and Harry there, and I've seen a few questions coming through, so perhaps this is a good time to move over to Q&A.
I think that's probably a good idea. We've got some questions coming through right now. Let's just get our speakers to unmute and get their videos on. That would be great. Oh, okay. So the first question that actually came in is really for Harry, and it's from Douglas Wren, and he says that, do the changes that you're making in Penshurst keep the farm economically viable? And if the economic cost is great, how do we incentivize farmers, and I guess that's anywhere, to invest in their soil?
That's a great question. Yeah, so with some of these practices, you will see a reduction in yield, especially at the beginning, because, for example, some of our rotations, we have 2 years where we take no crops off the ground, where we just grow nitrogen fixing legumes and things like that. So through the current countryside stewardship scheme, we do get a payment for that. So that has enabled us to put these fields into long-term sustainable strategies. Without that, there's no chance you could do that. You'd need to grow a crop to earn money. So these schemes we're very lucky in the UK how this exists. There are schemes that provide some money, and that's where I'm really hoping these environmental land management coming in 2024 will be more of these sort of things, and more farmers will take them up. But we need incentives. I mean, there's ways to farm regeneratively, but I think if we want to be make really, really positive steps, we're going to need funding, because the vast majorities of woodland, you can't make money off woodland unless you're paid to do it. So that's something I'm really hopeful for.
Thanks very much. Patrick, maybe a question for you is, how easy is it to persuade farmers to plant trees from the premium when, as you've already described, they're not really getting a living wage out of the crop they're producing?
Thank you, host. It's with culturally, even before we became commercial farmers, the way our grandfathers and ancestors lived, they were very close to nature. So actually, in my community, forests are sacred places. You are not supposed to interfere with them. And nobody used to cut firewood, even in the forest. You would go and pick what has dropped after the tree is tired. So you could pick the firewood on the floor of the forest. It was not, they didn't even have the equipment to fell down trees unless for buildings. So there is that, and the wells and the rivers were protected culturally. All over the Republic of Kenya, you find that where rivers are, wells, springs, and forests, they are protected by some kind of a cultural practice that tries to maintain them. So we didn't know that our grandparents, our ancestors, were actually conservationists. When now commercial interest came in, and people started felling trees for commercial use or building better houses, the technology for building houses, the ones that we use, which were sustainable materials, which were locally sourced, you are now to dig up rivers to get the sand, to break ground to get the stones, the gravel, and all those things. All these things cumulatively degenerated the cover, the forest cover. And then now crops like tea, when they came, and the other cash crops as they are, they also had their own effects, because basically where tea was planted, in most cases, you find that there was a forest before the tea. Where you find the coffee, there was a forest before the coffee. So it was a displacement of the forest with the cash crop that we had. That's a kind of a colonial legacy, but that's how the economy of the world was going all over. That's even in your country, trees were cut to grow, to increase the area under wheat or other food. So when we talk about when now all these things gelled together, and we started realizing there is a problem. The cutting down of the trees is having an impact on the amount of rainfall, is having an impact on the soil structure. I'll answer this together with the question I was asked of how do you walk the water to the river? Now, when there was tree cover, actually water walked to the river, because there will be the root system will hold the water, will hold the soil. The leaves of the trees will provide security. You don't have the drops beating the earth with an impact where it will displace some soil. So it's kind of, all that is controlled, and it falls down slowly to the soil. And when it gets to the ground, the leaf cover, the mulch on the ground, will retain the soil and let a little go in and let a little walk. You get it's very easy. If the water will fall down, the speed of it and the force when it hits the ground is broken by the tree cover. And when it hits the ground, there is a mulch. There's a cover between the soil and an organic cover between the soil and the raindrops. That water will literally walk to the river. If that, in places where that does not happen, you find gullies will form, because water now will flood to the river. It will carry away the topsoil. It will do a massive landslide, and you see the soil that was holding crops, because you removed the trees, is going to the river running, and it will end up in the ocean, the Indian Ocean in our case. So to walk the water to the river is a concept where you plant trees, And this is a system of water harvesting. Water to us is a scarce commodity. And in the around 50 years time, the next water wars in Africa, the next wars will be water wars. We are in a high value ecosystem, high value economic zone, where it is a water tower. And all this water goes downstream. After the coming from the forest here and the tea plantations, it will go to the people who are downstream and they're farming the crops that we eat, the cereals and the vegetables that we consume. So if water is not retained here, if we do banned agricultural practices here, if we don't practice sustainable agriculture, it will mean that the water will not be enough for the people down. It will be here and they'll come for it here. So when you walk the water to the river, it will get to them at a speed that is sustainable. It will also not wash away their soil. So it's a concept of water harvesting at a larger scale. You let the earth itself harvest the water and retain it, and release just a little of what is needed for crops and the animals and the entire structure. So that is what it means. So it's not hard for us to convince a farmer to plant trees. It's something that he can see the effect immediately. We rehabilitate 150 meters of river. You find the water rises again. You find the different kind of frogs, fish, the flora and fauna changes immediately. And you say, this used to be here when I was a small child. Now it has come back. But you are creating the environment for it to come back again. It never went away, but you really kind of destroyed where it was living. So it's so not hard for farmers to do that. And then because of the alternative energy sources, firewood is the only source. Mostly it's 90% of the energy requirement in the house, cooking, charcoal, firewood. So we have alternative, which we have trained our farmers through Fairtrade premiums of alternative energy sources. Like we have GCOs that are made of clay that can take little charcoal. They can also use firewood. And then we have firewood trees. Every farm now, a farmer will plant trees that he can harvest for firewood. That tree, you don't drop it down. You cut the branches during the dry season like now. And when it rains around April, May, you have firewood for the homestead. It will regenerate very fast. By July, August, you still cut some more firewood. So that is a sustainable way of living with the environment without doing a lot of damage. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Patrick. What a great answer that is. And I'd just like to say there's lots of chat coming back saying how inspiring it is to hear from you and from Harry about the things you're doing to try and re-establish the ecosystem. Got a great question from Peter Lidstone, which is really for you, Adam, and that is, what more could Fairtrade do to try and help farmers get a living wage, and we understand about the what it's doing, but there is a lot of injustice in the market, and as Patrick has pointed out, an awful lot of money is taken up in the value chain. It doesn't actually get to the producers. So how could Fairtrade work harder in that system?
Well, it's a great question, and yeah, Patrick might have some thoughts on that too. I think, firstly, as I mentioned before, Fairtrade has got fantastic recognition in the UK and high sales, but really it's an example of how how trade can be done better, but at the global level, it's still quite a minor player. I don't know what the proportion of tea globally that's traded as fair trade, but I'm sure it's sort of under 1%. So certainly growing of fair trade sales, growing fair trade demand is certainly helping in that way, and to show that this can happen at scale, which then really interests the larger players and the larger powers which are there. I think ultimately as well, it's a question not just as consumers, but for us as citizens. Is this the kind of world that we want to see, where milk produced in the UK can be bought at such a low price that it's below a sustainable cost of production? And it's the same with tea. I saw a press release or I saw an article a few years ago with milk farmers tipping milk out in the supermarkets, and it could have been, you could have just replaced the word milk with tea or bananas, and it was exactly the same issues. So I think it's also about moving on to raise our voices as citizens, saying this isn't how we think global value chain should work. We think it should be shared more equitably. And ultimately, you know, companies can voluntarily commit to that, but ultimately that's something to take to our political decision makers as well, and people that set policy about how trade takes place and how trade policy and other government regulations can actually support that.
Well, I mean, interestingly, someone else has asked a question, which is really a branding question. So many of the supermarkets have come in with their own ideas about, you know, what fair trade looks like. It feels like they've really diluted the impact of fair trade in the same way that they did with the impact of, say, of organic produce. You know, they've turned it into something that really doesn't mean anything. I'm thinking, I don't want to call them out, but, you know, Sainsbury's, I'm going to call them out, Sainsbury's, you know, really not providing a premium, but saying this is fair trade, or anyone that says, well, I work with a local producer and that helps them get a good price. Yeah, how can consumers actually discriminate better, or is it just a question of, well, you know, look for fair trade on the packet, and if that's the answer, how can you do more to make more people aware?
Yeah, if I may take that from my point of view. Sorry, Adam.
That's okay.
From my point of view, it was quite a shock when the market chain, where the merchants and the buyers and the superstores, they are all looking for a super profit. So the cheaper it is here, the more money they'll get at the end of it, without my product tea being expensive to a UK consumer. So what do? It is rigged in such a way that I have no option as a farmer to earn value. If it is a dairy farmer in your country, he has to take his milk directly through a kind of process where it will go to the market, to the supermarket. But if you are to take it himself, hand value and do things to it and sell the finished product to the supermarket, you cut the supply chain by around 40%, which you earn him more money. But the whole system all over is rigged in a way that the producer at the bottom of the pile is always absorbing all the cost of production, and the other guys on top get to earn more. So how can it be done? You find that in your country, possibly you sponsor a school to be built, or you give a loan to the government of Kenya to build a hospital. If you go to that hospital, you find that the most of the diseases that are being treated are climate related. They are nutritional related. And what does that show you? If you came to the fair trade model and supported my business by buying at a fair price, where I get a premium and do these social programs, you don't need an hospital. Where I teach farmers to use the integrated pest management system, where I train farmers not to use pesticides, you find the cases of cancer in hospitals, and those diseases related to pesticides and synthetic fertilizers, they won't disappear. So you don't need the expensive equipment that you need to sustain in the hospital. So where do we start? It starts with a fair mind, that the best form of charity is fair trade. Simple. I'm in business already. I'm just asking for a fairer price. Fair trade does very well because we now get to link with the buyers who will declare a premium. That goes a long way. I've just enumerated a few things we have done, and that is less than 1% of our tea that has been sold on fair trade terms, although 100% is fair trade. But only the market will take only 1%. So what does that mean? That 1% I must maximize on the maximum impact it can have on the community. Imagine if it was 10%.
Yeah.
It could be phenomenal.
It would.
The concept we are telling people that if you can grow it, don't buy it, It can apply everywhere in the world. Let's all of us buy what we can't grow. And it is just a paradigm shift along the value chain, and it means the policymakers to start seeing this as a generational problem. Just like we said slavery was banned, and it was banned all over the world. Just the same way we say racism is banned, and it was banned all over the world. It is now, it looks better when we are now talking as human beings, that everybody needs a hand to pull them from a level of poverty of one kind or the other. So it needs the political class to push the business class to think fairly. And how much is enough really? You know, if you have £1 million shillings or £1 million and £2 million, you still sleep on the same bed and you eat with one spoon and one plate at a time, and you sit on one chair at a time. You don't sit on two. So how much is enough? That's what we need to change in the world. Simple.
Very, very true. Very true. Thank you again, Patrick. Got a question. Listen, this is scheduled to finish in 3 minutes' time. And if I'm honest with you, I don't really know what happens with this platform. So if we suddenly go blank, I'm really sorry, but we'll continue with these questions and hopefully Zoom will continue to support us. I've got a question for Harry from Connor in York, and he's saying, how do you balance the benefits to the soil from rearing cattle with the cost to the environment? And is there a sustainable way that we can raise and consume beef and dairy?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a really balanced question because I think as humans, we love black and white issues. We like right and wrong. In this circumstance, it's right. It's never, you know, it's never right or whatever. But really, it is quite a grey area. So a lot of farms are very different. Like half of our farm, probably about half of our farm floods every winter because it's on a floodplain. So we cannot grow crops in these places. It's been, through studies, it's been seen that much lower levels of grass-fed, so grass grazing ruminants, which are cattle and sheep, they can produce sustainable systems. And this methane only exists in the atmosphere for about 7 years, whereas the statistics don't often represent this. So with lower numbers of grazing without feed being brought in, so when you have to have another farm to produce the food for your sheep, that's not a sustainable system. But with lower numbers, and I think as consumers in the UK, you know, where we can, if we want to eat meat, which I think you can do, we should be eating less meat and spending the same budget we had on much better meat, and choosing, you know, buying locally, buying British, buying grass-fed, which are sustainable systems. So that, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. And also these, I mean, I also believe that animals have a part to play. For example, our wheat that we grew last winter, half of it has failed because of the floods and the wet weather. So we're going to have to stitch in some spring crops, which means that we cannot sell this crop this year as milling wheat. So it's not of the grade to go for bread. So therefore, it is almost a byproduct. So these sort of waste products can be used in an animal feed. So again, it's quite a complicated system. You can use the manure to fertilize organic farms. A lot of organic food essentially isn't vegan food because it's got it's fertilized with animal manure. So they can really complement each other, but it's lower numbers. It's more extensive systems rather than intensive farming.
Thanks very much. Yep, a question of balance, as you say. Thanks very much for your answer. I guess a question for Adam here. The governments of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire have relatively good rules for cocoa prices. Is Fairtrade putting pressure on governments, including the UK government? Although I recognise we have got people on this webinar today from Switzerland and Spain and from Belgium too. But is there pressure on governments to do more along these lines? Because that would be, you know, a beneficial way of changing the global position.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's seen really welcome steps forward from the Ghanaian and Ivorian governments, where 70% of the world's cocoa comes from, in increasing the floor prices paid across the board to all cocoa farmers. it's a very fair trade response in a way, because to one of the questions earlier about the sort of the wallpaper of sustainability schemes that are there now, that question of price and delivering a fairer price is sort of often overlooked. So that's one of the questions to ask with all the any other initiatives that you see. What is the price being paid, and how is it calculated to be fair? It's a really positive move to see, and yeah, it's been one of the focuses of our work in the UK for the last few years. Has been a campaign for living incomes, recognizing that will take a little while, will take a few years, but really does need that strong action. So there was a large petition last year, I think it was, over 50,000 people handed in, which has opened up conversations that we've been having with government departments about the role that they can play. But I think with so many issues on their agenda the last couple of years, it is an ongoing fight. But it's one that we see more and more people joining in with. And I think, you know, bringing the social issues of child labour on cocoa farms, and the environmental issues too of deforestation caused by excessive cocoa growth are really useful ways to press that point home. And there are potentially some pieces of legislation coming up over the next year or so where we'll have an opportunity to influence that.
Brilliant. And just sort of following on from that, Mary has asked, are there plans for the Fairtrade Foundation to support tea and coffee processing in East Africa and other regions, and get those products into Europe?
Yeah, indeed. And there's, you know, one of the great benefits of the additional Fairtrade premium going to farmers and workers to provide more options to choose how to diversify their income or capture more value. It's an important way forward, and there are, you know, examples of tea farmers coming together to have their own factory to do a bit more processing. The same with sugar and even cocoa producers too, now creating their final bars of chocolate. So that is a part of the solution to the question that came earlier as well, in terms of achieving those living wages and capturing more of the value. And I don't know, Patrick might be able to say more about the possibilities for Michi as well to take steps. But I know it's not easy, and it takes a lot of investment as well, which is why it's so important to get more finance in the hands of farmers.
Exactly. In our case, what Adam has just passed through, as he has just like summarized what is required to be done. Just to add a bit more is that when Fairtrade is with us, it's something we have taken as a culture. So, and don't ask what I'm chewing. We normally, when we are plucking, you take the band, because you take the two leaves and the band. So when you feel a bit, you can chew the band. So that's what I'm thinking. Fairtrade is a cultural thing that you need. It came so when it agrees with a lot with our past cultural practices about fairness. So it really enforces them and puts us in the 21st century with things that when you tell your grandfather, you tell you, but that is obvious. That's what you should do. So when you say this is Fairtrade, our grandparents will tell us that is how it should be. So fair treatment of workers in working place, taking care of the environment, deploying the premiums for the needs the community has identified. The problem is training. More money is needed for training purposes, because conservation has to start with the farmer, changing the mind and let the farmer see. And then when he interacts with the soil, with the environment, you know what to do. You know what not to do. You know what to improve. because you have given him the right tools at training. And most of the time it's so hard to train. These people, farmers, have to go to their farms every day. It's a job that you go from morning to evening. And then to get them to come for training takes a lot of effort, because that day, that person will not have worked. And there's a possibility that you'll go hungry. So we customize our trainings that they are on farm, and we call it farmers field schools, where you get them on the farm and train them on the farm. You hope that out of 10, they'll get 2. The next day you repeat 3, and they'll come back to you now with the questions and the suggestions. That's where now you start moving. So a lot of resources need to be deployed on training. And the way we are, it's not easy to get the funding for trainings especially. So we don't do things, as I told you, the 1% is not enough to do what we have in mind to do, but we do better if we get more. But at the moment, we have taken Fairtrade as an initiative that we own. What we require, every producer requires, is support to sustain and keep the momentum going. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Well, there's a couple more questions, and I see that there's still nearly 70 people on. So I'm guessing that by staying here, you're interested, or you've just left the webinar running while you get your lunch or something. But let's carry on with the questions. Very important question for you, Adam, and that is, bearing in mind this is about climate change. What are you doing about mitigating the carbon footprint associated with products like flowers and wine, which can be easily sourced in Europe, but are being brought in from sort of Africa, South Africa, and South America?
Yeah, so doing a few things, and I suppose the answer really is follows from what Harry was saying a couple of questions ago, that it's, I guess it's not quite as black and white as not consuming that and only sourcing locally. Firstly, because we already import a lot of these things. We don't produce enough locally to satisfy the demand of things like wine and sugar. And I guess also, we also reconcile that because there are people whose livelihoods really depends on those sales, and through whichever forces that they've started to grow those crops. And so I suppose there are many ways that we can reduce our carbon footprints before we come to sort of choking off the trade that vulnerable communities are relying on. But not to say that there aren't ways to reduce the emissions which do take place along supply chains. I mean, firstly, through Fairtrade standards, they do include requirements not to use the worst pesticides and chemicals. And Fairtrade standards have been adapted in recent years to include carbon reduction programs for smallholder organizations, for example, alongside training from Fairtrade producer networks and others in terms of more carbon-friendly farming methods. There's also a lot of work to do in terms of shipping and transport, and analysis that we've done to try and work out how do we keep on consuming coffee and wine and importing these things and get to net zero by 2050. And there's you know, we need a lot of innovation in the way that we transport as well. There are potential, you can vastly reduce the overall carbon impact of products by having greener ways of shipping, for example, for reducing certain fertilizer and pesticide use on the farm, by having more regenerative processes at the farm level. And these are all different things that Fairtrade is working towards.
Got you.
But I'd say, yeah, it's consume less but better.
Yeah, like where you saying we are now investing in solar and wind. So solar and wind, that's green energy. So you reduce fossil fuel that goes to the processing method of our products. So it becomes more sustainable because now it's green energy. So at the moment now we are at around 40% green energy. And that's something we intend we intend to get to around 75% in the next 5 years. That is holistically, at the farm level and at the factory level. So you can see that cuts a lot, and still that will also improve the climate and the environment, because not many trees will be cut to get firewood for use in the factory or other places. So we are also looking at that, and the trainings Adam has mentioned is part of what was funded by Fairtrade Foundation and Cafe Direct in 2007, and we called it adaptation to climate change. And that we are carrying through as we speak, and we are seeing phenomenal things happening in our environment.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Patrick. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Mandy Flashman-Wells now. She is, I guess she runs Tunbridge Wells Fairtrade Town Group, and she's going to say a few words just to kind of wrap us up. So Mandy, over to you.
Oh, hello, everyone. That was just brilliant. Thank you so much, Patrick, Kaberia, for coming all the way from Kenya. Amazing to actually see your farm. And then Harry, brilliant to connect you both together, because we're all, you farmers are facing the same problems, and having to work to mitigate climate change when maybe we aren't doing what we can do is we need to think more about our climate footprint as individuals and what we can do. You're all planting trees and doing everything you can to protect the environment. We need to do the same thing. So thank you, Adam, for joining us and answering those difficult questions as ever. And thank you so much, Madam Mayor, because without the support of the council, we couldn't be a fair trade town. I just want to say thank you to those people who work behind the scenes, Adrian and Jacqueline, Julian and Linda. They're part of the Fairtrade Town team, but you don't see them very often, same as you don't really see Damien, but he's good at leading webinars, which is why we gave him this task. Thank you very much. So, we need to remember to support our local farmers and to support fair trade, because the issues of climate change are not going to get any better unless we do something about it. And of course, for farmers like Patrick, it's not just about food, it's about education and health. These are issues we don't face to such a degree here. So just want to thank you all again for coming along. It's just been fascinating and amazing. Brilliant to talk to you all. Thank you.